have spent a century turning them into movie monsters. We've wrapped them in linen, cast them in gold, and sold them as relics of a vanished golden age. But these preserved bodies were never meant to be found, and the structures that held them were never meant to be entered. The ancient Egyptians didn't build the pyramids to be monuments. They built them to be prisons. In the shadows of the necropolis, mummification wasn't an act of love. It was a desperate, high-stakes science of containment. The ancients knew something we have forgotten, that a human being is not one soul, but 5. And while the heart may be weighed by the gods, the Sheut, the shadow, remains tethered to the earth. A predatory, silent double that hungers for the life it once held. From the terrifying discovery of the screaming mummy to the gold-tongued witnesses of the underworld, we are peeling back the bandages on a reality far darker than Hollywood. We're exploring the forbidden rituals of the Lector Priests, the biological weapons hidden in sealed granite vaults, and the true nature of the second death. This is not a story of kings and crowns. This is the history of the monsters we created to keep the darkness at bay. Because when you disturb a mummy, you aren't just waking a body. You are inviting the shadow to follow you home. July 1881. The heat in the Valley of the Kings is a physical weight, pressing the oxygen out of the air. Emil Brugsch, a German Egyptologist, is being lowered down a 40-foot shaft by a single fraying rope. He is following a lead from a family of local tomb robbers, the Abd el-Rasuls, who have been selling royal artifacts on the black market for years. As Brugsch's boots hit the floor of the subterranean gallery, the smell hits him first. It isn't just dust. It is the scent of 3,000 years of concentrated resin, natron, and something else. Something organic. He raises his torch. The light trembles across a narrow corridor packed floor to ceiling with coffins. But these aren't just any coffins. These are the lost kings. Rameses the Great, Seti I, Thutmose III. They had been moved here in secret by priests of the 21st dynasty to protect them from the very robbers who led Brugsch here. But as Brugsch pushes deeper into the silence, he finds a cedar box that has no name, no gold, no prayers. He pries the lid. He expects a king. He finds a scream. A man wrapped in the unclean skin of a sheep, his hands and feet bound so tightly the bone has notched the flesh. His face is a mask of agony, a wide-set jaw, teeth bared, eyes seemingly bulging behind the linen. Brugsch would later write that the silence in that room felt heavy, as if the air itself was trying to keep the man's story from being told. This wasn't a burial. It was a ritualistic silencing. In 1881, deep within the Deir el-Bahari cache, archaeologists uncovered a plain, undecorated cedar coffin. There were no royal titles, no prayers to Osiris, no name to identify the occupant. When the lid was pried away, the team didn't find the serene crossed-arm pose of a pharaoh. Instead, they found a nightmare, frozen in time. Known to history as Unknown Man E, the mummy's head was thrown back at an impossible angle. His mouth was stretched open in a literal silent scream of bone and desiccated tissue. But the true horror wasn't his expression, it was his shroud. Unlike the clean, ritualistic linen of the elite, this man was wrapped in sheepskin. To the ancient Egyptians, wool was ritually unclean, a material believed to block the soul from reaching the afterlife. This was a man intentionally cursed. Modern CT scans and DNA analysis suggest this was Prince Pentawere, the son of Rameses III, executed for his role in the harem conspiracy to assassinate his father. His mummification was a technological punishment. He was preserved just enough to keep his spirit bound to the earth, but denied the purity required to ever leave it. He was a mutt, a restless, malevolent ghost, by design. To understand why the screaming mummy is so terrifying, we have to look at the Egyptian concept of the soul. They believed a person was a complex machine of 5 distinct parts. There was the ka, the vital life force that required sustenance; the ba, the personality depicted as a human-headed bird; the ak, the transfigured intellect; and the ren, the secret name. But it is the 5th part that haunts history, the Sheut, or the shadow. The Egyptians believed the shadow was a physical extension of the person, a dark, predatory double. In life, your shadow follows you. In death, if the rituals fail, the Sheut detaches. It becomes a shadow soul that can move through tomb walls, haunt the living, and feast on the life force of others to sustain its existence. The massive stone sarcophagi and the miles of linen weren't just for preservation. They were anchors meant to pin the shadow to the floor of the tomb, preventing it from wandering the desert as a hunter. The city of the dead at Saqqara wasn't a cemetery, it was a laboratory. Every tomb was an engine built to manage these 5 parts. When we see a mummy today in a museum, we are looking at a deactivated machine. The priests knew that if the body rotted, the 5 parts would dissolve into chaos. But if the body was preserved improperly, like unknown man E, the result was a walking dead scenario the ancients feared above all else. They called these beings the Mutu. These weren't slow-moving zombies. They were spiritual predators that brought disease, nightmares, and madness to any family that dared to forget them. The screaming mummy serves as our first warning. The Egyptians didn't just respect their dead, they were terrified of them. In the year 1110 BCE, during the reign of Rameses IX, a stonemason named Amenpanufa was brought before the vizier of Thebes. He was accused of the ultimate sacrilege. Under the bastinado, a ritual beating of the feet, Amenpanufa confessed to a crime that terrified the state. "We went to rob the tombs," the court transcript, known as the Abbot Papyrus, records. "We found the noble pyramid of King Sobekemsaf. We took our copper tools and forced a way into the pyramid. We found the king's burial chamber. We found the mummy of the king, and beside it the mummy of his queen. We stripped off the gold, the amulets, and the jewels. And then we set fire to their coffins." To an Egyptian, this wasn't just theft, it was murder on a cosmic scale. By burning the bodies, Amenpanufa was releasing the Sheut, the shadow, without its anchor. He was creating a predator. The 70-day labor of mummification we see in the archaeological record was a direct response to this fear. Every layer of resin was a barrier built against men like Amenpanufa. To the modern eye, mummification is a morbid curiosity, a relic of a primitive obsession with the afterlife. But to the inhabitants of the Nile Valley, it was a high-stakes biological and spiritual surgery that lasted exactly 70 days, a number dictated by the celestial cycle of the star Sirius. The process began not with prayer, but with a calculated desecration in the Per-Nefer, the house of embalming. This was a place of blood, salt, and shadow, where the living labored to forge a vessel capable of surviving eternity. The first act of this 70-day siege was the work of the parashist, or the ripper. Using a blade of obsidian, a volcanic glass sharper than any surgical steel, the priest opened the left flank of the body. In a bizarre ritualistic twist, once the cut was made, the other embalmers would pelt the parashist with stones and chase him away. They had to punish him for wounding the body, even though the wound was necessary, creating a layer of spiritual insurance to shift the blame for the body's violation. Then came the evacuation of the self. The internal organs, the liver, lungs, stomach, and intestines, were removed with clinical precision. These were not discarded. They were treated with the same reverence as the body itself, placed into the 4 canopic jars, each guarded by a son of the god Horus. These jars were the first line of defense, keeping the vital functions of the soul separate yet accessible. The brain, however, was treated with a cold, terrifying detachment. Using a bronze hook inserted through the ethmoid bone in the nose, the embalmers would whisk the brain into a liquid state and drain it. To the Egyptians, the brain was merely a producer of mucus, a useless organ for the journey ahead. The heart, however, remained. It was the seat of the soul, the biological hard drive containing every memory, every sin, and every virtue. If the heart was lost or destroyed, the person ceased to exist in any plane of reality. Once the organs were cleared, the body was packed with natron, a naturally occurring salt that acted as a relentless desiccant. For 40 days, the corpse sat in this salt, which chemically pulled every molecule of moisture from the muscle and skin. This wasn't just preservation, it was a transformation. The salt didn't just dry the skin, it darkened it and hardened the flesh until it reached a wood-like consistency. By the end of this period, the person was gone, replaced by a biological relic, a vessel that could now withstand the thousands of years required for the bar to find its way back home. The skin was then massaged with milk, honey, and expensive resins to restore a haunting leather-like suppleness, while the body was stuffed with sawdust or linen to restore its human shape. They were building a statue made of human remains. While the embalmers worked on the flesh, the Kiriheb, or Lector Priests, worked on the spirit. Draped in leopard skins and carrying scrolls of papyrus, these men were the true jailers of the shadow. They believed that during these 70 days, the Sheut was at its most volatile, confused, hungry, and prone to leaking out of the Per Nefer to haunt the family of the deceased. To prevent this, the priests used Heka to bind the shadow into the very bandages of the mummy. As the miles of linen were wrapped around the body, specific amulets were tucked into the folds at precise anatomical points, a heart scarab over the chest to prevent the heart from testifying against the deceased, and a jed pillar at the spine to provide eternal stability. The final result was a bound soul. The linen wasn't just a shroud, it was a ritual straitjacket, reinforced by thousands of whispered incantations designed to ensure that when the mummy was placed in the dark of the tomb, it stayed exactly where it was put. In the Metternich Stela, a 4th century BCE artifact, we find a record of how the Egyptians viewed the supernatural power of mummified spirits. The stela describes spells used to repel the dead who come in the dark. It recounts instances where people were struck with sudden, inexplicable illnesses believed to be caused by a mutt, a mummy whose shadow had escaped. Ancient medical papyri, such as the Edwin Smith Papyrus, often blended clinical surgery with incantations. If a patient showed signs of wasting, the diagnosis was often that a spirit was breathing into their ear or eating their car. This was the functional reality of Heka. It wasn't a myth. It was the ancient equivalent of a germ theory. The opening of the mouth ceremony was the final desperate act to give the mummy the tools to fight these entities in the underworld, or to prevent the mummy itself from becoming one of them. In the shadow of the step pyramid, Heka was a concrete branch of physics. Without it, the mummy remained a hollow shell. The activation required the wepeter, or the opening of the mouth ceremony. Standing before the upright mummy at the entrance of the tomb, a priest donned the jackal-headed mask of Anubis, the god of mummification. In his hand, he held the Pesesh Kef, a ritual blade crafted from flint or bronze, shaped like the tail of a fish. This tool was a direct descendant of the instruments used to sever the umbilical cord at birth. The ceremony was, in essence, a second delivery into the world of the dead. With precise rhythmic strikes, the priest touched the eyes, the ears, the nose, and the lips of the linen-wrapped figure. The goal was to hack the senses back into the spiritual plane, allowing the mummy to breathe, see the light of the underworld, and most crucially, to speak. The power to speak was the power to survive. The Egyptian afterlife, or the duat, was a labyrinth guarded by gatekeepers with names like "He who dances in blood" and "He who eats the droppings of his behind." To pass, the deceased had to recite the secret names of these demons. If the opening of the mouth was performed incorrectly, the soul remained mute and defenseless, destined to be consumed by the horrors of the dark. But there was an even greater danger. By opening the mummy's senses, the priests were also creating a two-way portal. If the heart of the deceased was heavy with malice, the ritual didn't just awaken a traveler, it unleashed the Sheut. This detached shadow could now use its newly restored senses to hunt the living, slipping through the false doors of the tomb to settle old debts. Beyond the ritual of the mouth, the tomb itself functioned as a piece of automated software. The walls were inscribed with thousands of lines of hieroglyphic code, the pyramid texts and the coffin texts, designed to act as a permanent, invisible defense system. These weren't mere decorations, they were programmed spells. Some were designed to turn the mummy invisible to predatory spirits, while others were meant to magically provide bread and beer if the living stopped bringing offerings. The most frightening among these were the execration texts. Archaeologists have unearthed thousands of clay figures, often bound at the wrists and ankles, buried at the thresholds of the great necropolis. These were soul-binding devices. By writing the name of a restless spirit or an enemy on the clay and ritually smashing it, the priests believed they were literally shattering the target's existence in the afterlife. In the forbidden science of the pharaohs, the greatest weapon wasn't a sword. It was the ability to erase a man's name from the universe, condemning him to the second death, a state of eternal non-existence from which there was no return. In the year 820 AD, the Abbasid Caliph al-Ma'mun arrived at the base of the Great Pyramid of Giza with an army of engineers and a singular obsession: to find the secret chamber of the ancients. For weeks, his men hammered at the limestone casing, eventually using fire and cold vinegar to crack the massive blocks. When they finally breached the structure, they didn't find a grand hallway, they found a mountain of silence. As they pushed through the narrow, suffocating passages, the men began to experience a collective terror. Chroniclers recorded that the men reported hearing the beating of wings in the dark and felt an invisible pressure pushing against their chests, a physical sensation of being crushed by the silence. When they reached the king's chamber, they found a room of polished red granite containing nothing but an empty, lidless sarcophagus. The men fled the pyramid in a state of panic, convinced that the guardian of the pyramid, a spirit with a stone face, was chasing them through the tunnels. This wasn't a legend, it was a recorded physical reaction to the architecture of the Old Kingdom. The Caliph had breached a machine designed to be impenetrable, and the horror his men felt was the intended result of thousands of tons of stone pressing down on a single point of dark, stagnant air. When we look at the Great Pyramids of Giza, we see monuments of ego, vast limestone beacons to the power of a single man. But to the architects of the Old Kingdom, these were not just tombs, they were massive, stone-clad machines of containment. The necropolis was a landscape of fear, a city of the dead where every stone was laid with a singular terrifying purpose: to keep the spirit anchored and the living protected. The transition from the simple mastaba, a flat-topped mud brick bench, to the towering peaks of the Fourth Dynasty was an escalation in the war against the restless soul. If the mummy was the prisoner, The pyramid was the ultimate maximum security vault. At the heart of this architectural obsession was the false door. To the casual observer, it is a blind archway, a solid stone slab carved with the likeness of the deceased, leading nowhere. But in the spiritual physics of Egypt, the false door was a one-way valve. It was a portal through which the Ba, the personality, could fly out into the world of the living to partake in offerings of bread and beer, but it was ritualistically locked against the Sheut. The shadow was meant to remain in the subterranean darkness, pinned beneath millions of tons of granite and limestone. The very weight of the pyramid was a physical manifestation of the need to suppress the dead, a geological thumb pressing down on the chest of the deceased to ensure they did not rise. Inside these structures, the layout was a masterpiece of spiritual misdirection. The labyrinths, the dead-end shafts, and the massive granite portcullis blocks were not merely to deter grave robbers. They were built to confuse the Mutu, the malevolent ghosts. The Egyptians believed that spirits moved in straight lines and could be trapped by complex geometry. By creating a tomb with no clear exit and filling it with magical bricks inscribed with binding spells, the architects were creating a spirit trap. One such brick, found in the tomb of Thutmose IV, warned, "I am the one who hinders the sand from choking the secret chamber. I am for the protection of the Osiris." These were not welcomes. They were warnings to any entity, living or dead, that dared to breach the seal. The true horror of the architecture lies in the Serdab, a small sealed chamber with no door, containing a statue of the deceased. 2 tiny holes were drilled into the wall at eye level. Through these spirit eyes, the Ka statue could watch the living as they performed rituals in the outer chapel. It is the ultimate voyeuristic nightmare, a silent stone occupant trapped in total darkness, watching the world through 2 pinpricks in the rock. This was the final layer of the Egyptian security system. If the mummy failed, the statue remained. If the tomb was breached, the shadow had a second vessel to inhabit. The entire necropolis was a redundant system of cages, a silent city where the dead were never truly gone. They were simply waiting behind walls of stone that we, in our curiosity, have finally begun to dismantle. In 2021, at the temple of Taposiris Magna near Alexandria, archaeologists led by Kathleen Martinez uncovered a series of burials that challenged our understanding of how the dead were meant to communicate. They found mummies from the Ptolemaic period with a startling gilded modification. Their organic tongues had been removed and replaced with leaves of solid gold. This was not a display of wealth, but a desperate final piece of spiritual technology. During the later periods of Egyptian history, the belief grew that the journey through the underworld was no longer just a series of gates, but a literal trial of rhetoric. To pass the tribunal of Osiris, the deceased had to speak with the eloquence of the gods. The gold tongue was a supernatural speaker, a ritualistic upgrade designed to allow the dead to argue for their existence in the language of the light, a tongue the living could never comprehend. Without it, the soul was mute, unable to plead its case against the devourer. The golden tongues weren't the only silent watchers found in the deep. Throughout the necropolis, archaeologists have uncovered the sons of the sun, mummies buried in unusual cramped positions that suggest they were not laid to rest, but stored. Some of these mummies were found with their hands over their faces, or with their knees pulled to their chests in a fetal position, a sharp departure from the traditional regal pose. These were the silent witnesses, individuals whose mummification was rushed or altered, possibly as a result of plague or ritual execution. Their presence in the periphery of royal tombs suggests a darker purpose. They were the ghost guard, souls tethered to the location to serve as eternal invisible sentries for the higher-ranking dead. The obsession with spiritual containment was not reserved solely for the elite. In the shadow of the Great Pyramid, in the Hayt el Ghurab workers' village, archaeologists uncovered a cemetery that tells a far more intimate story of fear. these were not kings. They were the stonemasons, weavers, and laborers who built the cages. Yet, even in their modest burials, we find the evidence of a ghost guard. These mummies, often referred to as the Sons of the Sun, were found in a state that suggests they were ritualistically stationed. Unlike the pharaohs who were laid out in regal, straight-backed majesty, many of these laborers were found in the fetal position, their bodies turned on their left sides, facing the rising sun to the east. Modern forensic analysis reveals that many of these individuals died from the brutal physical toll of their labor, crushed vertebrae, healed fractures, and evidence of massive infection. But it is their placement that is unsettling. They were buried in a dense perimeter around the royal necropolis. In the Egyptian mind, these workers were the sentries of the Sheut. By mummifying them in these defensive coiled poses, the priests were essentially creating a spiritual buffer zone. If the shadow of a pharaoh were to leak from its tomb, it would first encounter this army of silent witnesses. They were the first line of defense in the afterlife, souls bound by their very burial position to guard the rest of the great kings forever. It suggests that the science of the shadow was a social contract. The workers protected the king in life with their muscle, and they protected his spirit in death with their own eternal presence. The most unsettling of these finds are the execration figures found buried at the thresholds of the city of the dead. These are small, crudely carved dolls, often bound with real linen cords at the wrists and ankles. Unlike the majestic Sheut figures meant to serve the deceased, these were anti-souls. By inscribing the name of a restless spirit or a living enemy onto the clay and burying it in the path of a mummy's shadow, the priests were performing a form of ritualistic assassination. They believed that by binding the image, they were physically paralyzing the spirit in the duat, preventing it from ever moving forward. These discoveries suggest that the Egyptians were not just preparing for a peaceful transition, they were preparing for a war of words and wills. The gold tongues, the fetal-positioned guards, and the bound clay figures reveal a civilization that lived in a state of constant spiritual high alert. They knew that the silent land was anything but quiet. It was a place of debate, judgment, and predatory shadows, where the only way to survive was to have a tongue of gold and a heart as light as a feather. As we unearth these witnesses, we are not just finding bodies, we are finding the evidence of a 4,000-year-old defense strategy designed to keep the second death at bay. In 1990, during the excavation of the Tomb of the Builders near the Giza pyramids, the world-renowned archaeologist Zahi Hawass encountered a curse that had nothing to do with magic, but everything to do with the environment of the dead. As he and his team uncovered a sarcophagus belonging to the overseer of the royal tomb, they found a terrifying inscription. "All people who enter this tomb, may the crocodile be against them in water, and snakes against them on land." Shortly after breaching the seal, Hawass was suddenly struck with a sharp, blinding pain in his chest. He collapsed and was rushed to the hospital with a suspected heart attack. While the media immediately pointed to the pharaoh's vengeance, Hawass, once recovered, pointed to a much more terrestrial reality. He had been working in a sealed, unventilated limestone chamber for hours, inhaling the concentrated toxic dust of 4 millennia. This was a physical reaction to a chemical and biological environment that had been brewing since the Old Kingdom. The curse wasn't a spell cast by a priest. It was a prehistoric biological trap that had been waiting for the first person to provide it with fresh oxygen. To understand how a biological agent can be mistaken for a supernatural executioner, we must look at the most famous timeline of death in history, the opening of KV 62. When Howard Carter and Lord Carnarvon broke the seal of Tutankhamun's tomb in November 1922, they weren't just stepping into a treasure room, they were walking into a 3,000-year-old petri dish. The curse began its work almost immediately, but it didn't use magic. It used the vulnerability of the human body. Lord Carnarvon was the first to fall. In the spring of 1923, just months after inhaling the stagnant air of the burial chamber, he nicked a mosquito bite while shaving. In a normal environment, this would be a minor injury, but Carnarvon's lungs had already been sensitized by the heavy dust and fungal spores of the tomb. His immune system, struggling with what we now recognize as a dormant infection of Aspergillus flavus, could not fight off the secondary blood poisoning. He died in a Cairo hotel, raving about a shadow in the dark. The timeline continues with chilling precision. George J. Gould I, an American railway executive, entered the tomb in 1923. He died of a sudden, inexplicable fever shortly after. Prince Ali Kamel Fahmy Bey was shot by his wife shortly after visiting the tomb, a death attributed to the madness the shadow brings, but more likely a tragic coincidence fueled by the high-tension paranoia the curse narrative created. Then there was Sir Archibald Douglas Reed, the radiologist who X-rayed the mummy. He died in 1924 from a mysterious illness that mirrors the symptoms of acute radiation poisoning or severe fungal infection of the blood. When we track these deaths, a pattern emerges. The victims were almost exclusively those who spent the most time in the hot zone, the confined, airless space of the burial chamber where spores and radon gas were at their highest concentration. Those who stayed in the ventilated outer chambers or worked in the sun remained largely unaffected. The curse was a biological predator that targeted the lungs and the blood, choosing its victims based on their proximity to the breath of the ancestors. It was a slow-acting, microscopic vengeance that required no spells, only a deep breath in the dark. These documented cases highlight a singular truth. The biology of the curse is not a matter of superstition, but of science. As we saw with both Hawass and the victims of KV-62, the primary silent assassin is Aspergillus flavus. For decades, the world has whispered about supernatural vengeance, but the reality is that the Egyptians were master chemists who accidentally, or perhaps intentionally, designed their tombs to become toxic environments. When an archaeologist breaks a 3,000-year-old seal, they aren't just letting in the light. They are inhaling a concentrated soup of decay and dormant killers. This common mold, inside a sealed, stagnant limestone chamber, undergoes a transformation into a silent assassin. Its spores are incredibly resilient, capable of remaining dormant for millennia in the dry, airless dark. When a tomb is opened, these microscopic spores are kicked into the air. If inhaled, they trigger invasive aspergillosis, a devastating pulmonary infection that causes high fever and organ failure. But the biology of the curse goes deeper than fungus. The very process of mummification involved the use of resins, bitumen, and natron, substances that over thousands of years in a confined space break down into a volatile cocktail of gases. In many sealed tombs, the air is thick with high concentrations of ammonia, formaldehyde, and hydrogen sulfide. These gases can cause immediate respiratory distress, dizziness, and in some cases, vivid hallucinations. A tomb robber, lightheaded and gasping for breath in the flickering torchlight, might truly believe they are seeing the Sheut of the pharaoh detached and lunging from the shadows. The supernatural experience is often a physical reaction to a chemical weapon forged by time and decay. Furthermore, the geology of Egypt itself contributes to the vengeance of the dead. Many of the most famous tombs, including those in the Valley of the Kings, are carved into limestone and granite that contain trace amounts of uranium. In a sealed, unventilated stone vault, this uranium decays into radon gas. This colorless, odorless, radioactive gas pools in the lowest levels of the tomb, the very place where the sarcophagus is kept. A person spending hours in a newly opened chamber is essentially standing in a radioactive kill box. The mummy's curse might not be a spell cast by a priest, but a slow-acting poisoning of the blood and lungs, a literal breath of death that follows the intruder back into the sunlit world. The ancients may not have understood radiation or mycology, but they understood that some places were meant to stay dark and that the air of the ancestors was not meant for the lungs of the living. While the mythology of the judgment is found in the Book of the Dead, the historical reality of the Egyptian fear of judgment is found in the Papyrus Leopold II. This document records the trial of a gang of thieves who broke into the tomb of King Sobekemsaf II. The thieves weren't just interrogated, they were subjected to the bastinado, beating the soles of the feet with a rod until they confessed. What is striking about the transcript is not just the confession of theft, but the thieves' absolute terror of what they had done to the royal hearts. They admitted to stripping the heart scarabs from the mummies. In the Egyptian mind, stealing the gold was a crime against the state, but stealing the heart scarab was a crime against the universe. By removing the amulet, the thieves were effectively handcuffing the pharaoh in the afterlife, leaving his heart defenseless and naked before the scales of Osiris. The state's response was equally brutal. The thieves were impaled on wooden stakes. The punishment was designed to mirror the second death, a physical destruction so total that it mirrored the soul-eating they feared awaited them in the Duat. In the terrifying landscape of the Egyptian afterlife, the journey did not end with the closing of the stone sarcophagus. Beyond the physical walls of the tomb lay the Duat, a realm of twilight inhabited by gods, demons, and the restless shadows of the unworthy. For the deceased, every ritual, every bandage, and every ounce of natron was merely preparation for the ultimate judicial nightmare, the Hall of Two Truths. This was the moment of the Ab, the weighing of the heart. To the Egyptians, the heart was not just an organ, it was a witness. It was believed to record every deed, every lie, and every moment of malice committed during a lifetime. In the presence of Osiris, the Lord of the Dead, the deceased had to stand before 42 divine judges and recite the negative confession, swearing they had not stolen, murdered, or caused others to weep. The physical centerpiece of this trial was a massive, supernatural scale. On one side sat the heart of the deceased. On the other sat the feather of Mayat, the goddess of truth, balance, and cosmic order. This was the trial of the heart, a high-stakes balance where the margin for error was non-existent. If the heart was heavy with sin, if it outbalanced the delicate feather, the deceased was not merely punished, they were erased. The Egyptians did not believe in an eternal hell of fire. They believed in something far colder and more final, the second death. Waiting at the foot of the scales was the most feared entity in the Egyptian pantheon, Amit, the devourer of souls. A chimera of the three most dangerous predators known to the Nile, Amit possessed the head of a crocodile, the forequarters of a lion, and the hindquarters of a hippopotamus. She did not hunt the living. She waited for the judged. When a heart failed the test, it was tossed to her. In a single bone-crushing snap of her jaws, the heart was consumed, and with it, the soul's chance at immortality. This was the great destruction. Without a heart, the Ka and the Ba could never reunite. The deceased would vanish from the stars, forgotten by the gods and the living alike, cast into a state of permanent non-existence. To prevent this catastrophe, the Egyptians developed a specialized piece of legal software tucked into the mummy's bandages, the heart scarab. This large green stone amulet was inscribed with a specific command from the Book of the Dead. "O my heart, do not stand up as a witness against me. Do not create opposition against me in the council." It was, in essence, a gag order for the soul. The priests believed that by placing this amulet over the chest, they could magically prevent the heart from testifying to its own sins during the trial. Even in the face of divine judgment, the Egyptians were looking for a loophole, a way to trick the scales and silence the devourer. They knew that in the dark of the Duat, truth was a weapon, and only those who could successfully manipulate the shadows of their own past would survive to see the sun rise again. In the early 20th century, a legend began to circulate through the fog-heavy streets of London regarding British Museum item number 22,542. It wasn't a mummy at all, but a brightly painted gesso and wood mummy board belonging to an unidentified woman, possibly a high priestess of Amun-Ra from the 21st dynasty. The board was rumored to carry a malevolent charge that struck down anyone who possessed it. Stories told of photographers whose cameras shattered when trying to capture its likeness, and researchers who suffered sudden, debilitating illnesses. The legend reached its peak in 1912. A persistent urban myth claimed that the unlucky mummy had been purchased by a private collector and smuggled onto the RMS Titanic. According to the law, the ship's sinking was the result of the displaced shadow of the priestess wreaking havoc on the vessel's machinery as an act of vengeance for being removed from the Nile. While historical manifests prove the artifact never left the British Museum, the story itself is a real cultural phenomenon. It reflects a deep-seated human anxiety that has persisted since the 19th century. The fear that by uprooting the dead and placing them behind glass, we have unanchored their shadows and brought a primordial hunger into the modern world. For thousands of years, the city of the dead remained a silent, stone-bound equilibrium. The priests had done their work. The shadows were anchored, the portals were locked, and the dead were left to navigate the Duat in peace. But in the 19th century, that equilibrium was shattered. The era of mummy mania saw the systematic exhumation and exportation of Egypt's ancestors to the cold, damp museums of Europe and America. To the Victorian mind, a mummy was a curiosity, a conversation piece, or even a source of pigment. The morbid, mummy-brown paint used by artists of the era was quite literally made from ground-up human remains. But to the ancient Egyptian, this was the ultimate catastrophe. By moving a mummy from its intended fortress of eternity, we didn't just disturb a grave, we severed the anchor of the Sheut. When a mummy is displaced, the 5 parts of the soul are thrown into a state of metaphysical static. The car can no longer find its offerings, the bar can no longer find its body, and the Sheut, the predatory shadow, is released from the geographical cage of the tomb. This has led to a century of reported hauntings and bad luck associated with Egyptian collections. The most famous of these is the unlucky mummy of the British Museum. Technically not a mummy, but a painted wooden mummy board of an unidentified woman from the 21st dynasty. It gained a reputation for causing death, injury, and even the sinking of the Titanic, a myth but one that persists in the public consciousness. Witnesses in the museum have reported the sound of rhythmic sobbing and frantic banging coming from within the Egyptian galleries after the lights go out. The sound of a displaced soul searching for a home that no longer exists. The displacement of the shadow isn't just a matter of folklore. It is a psychological phenomenon that follows the dead. In many cultures, the curse of the pharaohs is seen as a form of spiritual trauma. When a body is unrolled under the bright lights of a lecture hall or subjected to the radiation of a CT scanner, we are stripping away the final layers of the heka that kept the spirit stable. Some modern practitioners of Egyptian spirituality believe that a displaced mummy becomes a hungry ghost, a mutt that clings to the museum staff or the visitors who linger too long. They argue that the shadow doesn't stay with the body. It follows the intent. It follows the people who took it. This leads us to the most unsettling question of modern Egyptology. What happens when the anchor is completely destroyed? In the Victorian era, mummy unrolling parties were social events where the elite would watch as the sacred bandages were hacked away to reveal the desiccated flesh beneath. Every layer of linen removed was a line of protective code deleted. When the amulets were pocketed as souvenirs and the body was left exposed to the air, the shadow was effectively cast adrift in a world it did not recognize. As these mummies sit in their glass cases, thousands of miles from the Nile, they are no longer kings or priests. They are displaced shadows, silent, invisible observers of a modern world that treats them as art, while they wait, patiently, for the light to change and the cage to open once more. We began this journey at the edge of a scream, the frozen, tortured face of unknown man E, and we end it in the sterile, climate-controlled galleries of the modern museum. For over 4,000 years, the sands of Egypt have acted as a shroud, a silent witness to a civilization that perfected the art of defying time. But as we have unraveled the bandages and decoded the Heka of the priests, we are left with a chilling realization. The mummy is not a monster born of folklore or cinema. It is the most human mirror we have ever held up to ourselves. Unlike the vampire, who represents a predatory immortality, or the werewolf, who represents the animal within, the mummy represents our own desperate, terrified refusal to vanish. Every pyramid, every amuleted wrap, and every golden tongue was a technological protest against the second death. The Egyptians didn't just believe in the afterlife, they engineered it. They built stone fortresses to imprison the Sheut and programmed the walls with spiritual code to bypass the devourer. They knew, as we are only beginning to rediscover, that to be forgotten is to cease to exist. But in our quest to save their history, we have committed the ultimate desecration. We have turned their sacred prisons into public spectacles, and their silent protectors into artifacts of curiosity. We have brought the shadow into the light of the 21st century, and in doing so we have invited the past to walk among us once more. The upcoming release of the 2026 film The Mummy is just the latest iteration of this eternal return. We are drawn to these figures, not because they are different from us, but because they are exactly like us, preserved, judged, and trapped by the weight of their own history. The shadows cast by the Great Pyramids at sunset are the same shadows that fell across the Nile in the time of Khufu. They haven't moved. They have simply waited for the light to change. And as we stand before the glass cases of our museums, looking into the hollow eyes of a pharaoh, we must ask ourselves, are we looking at a relic of the past, or are we looking at our own future, waiting to be anchored to the earth? The forbidden science of the Sheut reminds us that the past is never truly dead. It is merely waiting for someone to speak its name. And in the silence of the necropolis, the shadow still moves, tethered to the stone, watching the living with a patience that spans millennia. Because in the end, the Egyptians were right about one thing above all else. You can bury the body, you can erase the name, and you can hide the heart. But the shadow, the Sheut, never leaves. It just waits for the door to open.